right, next up we're going to do Triumph Gold. So Sean and I first invested in Triumph Gold at 6 cents about 3 years ago, and at this point we own, I want to say 17% of the company. Gold Corp came in after we did for 19.9%, and Xinjin is also in for 10%. The story was initially an optionality play, which is why I invested. They have 5.5 low-grade ounces in the Yukon. And when we first got in at a $2 million market cap, it seemed quite compelling. But the story has actually changed to something much more fascinating than that, and that's thanks to Dr. Tony Barresi, who's the VP of X and is going to be giving a presentation. And he gives a really awesome presentation that simple-minded people on the geology side like myself can actually grasp. So Tony, please come up and give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. So on Tuesday, I got a call from our executive chairman, John Anderson, that he was going to be in China and unable to make it to this conference. So I sharpened my crayons and put together some geological images that I thought I could present to non-geologists. Now, having been to this conference, I realized that I'm a bit of a chump. I usually go to conferences where I get a drink ticket. That's just about it. So I'm pretty happy to be here with you guys. I'm going to be telling the story today about the Freegold Mountain property and a company originally called Northern Freegold Resources that's now called Triumph Gold. This is a company that put together a highly prospective, very large land package in Yukon around 2005 and spent 10 years exploring that property, spending about $50 million on exploration, and that culminated with the development of, or definition of, 3 resources. All of the efforts went into defining those resources. And in the end, those resources were sub-economic at today's metal prices. And so the company sort of floundered, and in 2016, one of the investors, Gold 2000, was thinking of sort of forsaking the company completely and pulling out. But before they did that, they wanted us to look at, or the company to look at, exploration potential on the property. Not looking at the resources at all, but just exploration, pure greenfield style exploration on the property. And I'd done some consulting for Gold 2000. They made a very small investment in Triumph to bring me on to take a look at the property, and I came up with a few ideas. I was really bullish about this property after visiting it. And then that money was spent. The company called me up and said, hey, we can't pay you to do this, but we'd love for you to go to a conference in Yukon and present your ideas. And I said, well, you know, will you pay me the day I give the presentation at least? They said, okay. So I went. And that was the Yukon Geoscience Conference, a technical conference held in November of 2016. I gave my presentation about the exploration ideas that I came up with, and Gold Corp was in the room. They had just bought Kaminak for about $500 million, and they loved the idea that we came up with. A couple of months later, they bought 20% of our company for $6.3 million, and we have been spending that money since testing the ideas that we came up with. In 2017, we did one of the most aggressive drill programs the Yukon has seen, and we hit higher grade mineralization in almost every place we tested than the mineralization within the resources. We refined our geological model and ideas, and in 2018, this past field season, we made one of the best hits on a greenfields property anywhere in the world, discovering Yukon's highest grade porphyry. But we don't think that's anything compared to what we're about to discover in 2019. We believe it's geologically mandated that that high-grade mineralization is attached to something much, much larger. And I'm going to take you through the geological argument for that. So if you can stick with me for about 15 minutes of cartoon slides of geology, I will hopefully convince you that this is something that's not just going to blow the top off of our company, this is going to blow the top off of the Yukon. A little bit of background. Our flagship property, Freegold Mountain property, is located in Yukon. Everybody knows that Yukon has lots of metals, lots of gold. What it doesn't have a lot of is infrastructure, but we do. Our property is one of the only properties in Yukon that is road accessible. You can drive right up onto our property, and that road is currently the subject of government funding for an upgrade. They're going to turn it from a dirt road into a 80-kilometer-an-hour entirely government-maintained all-season road. And that funding is already in place, and the work is probably going to start this summer. We're also in a very prolific district. We're surrounded by all of the best projects in Yukon, or many of the best projects in Yukon. We're just south of the Minto mine. We're along strike of Goldcorp's Coffee project. We're along strike of Western Copper's Casino project. If Casino was where we are, they would already be a mine because they're not on a road, but we are, and that's their main limiting factor right now. The property itself is district scale, 200 square kilometers, 34 kilometers from end to end, and there's all kinds of showings across it. Now, I'm telling you about the big thing that we're really onto right now, but there's a lot more going on this property. So let's say we test this idea that I'm going to explain to you and we fail. What if we don't hit? Well, we're developing a bunch of pipeline projects on this property, so there's still an upside even on the downside, and we've got a couple of other properties that are interesting as well. There's corporate presentations on your table, and they outline some of these other opportunities. All right, here's our lousy resources. You know, the upside of having lousy resources is that, first of all, they're an optionality play, as Colin was saying. Price of gold goes up, maybe these things will be worth it someday. The other thing about having lousy resources is if you actually find something that demands an investment for a mill and a mine, you've already got something that's going to be mined. So if we get a mine and a mill, this stuff will become economic. The downside of having a lousy resource is that when you come out with it, nobody wants to invest in you anymore because they think that's what you've got. So the rest of what I'm going to be talking about from here on is greenfields exploration potential. Think of us as a greenfields company. Yukon is an amazing place to work, and we have all kinds of support from First Nations, governments, local communities, and this map is an example of some of that. The Yukon Geological Survey, a year after we started doing our work, made a brand new geological map of our property. They sharpened their crayons and came up with this thing. And this thing is really important for our exploration. First of all, it demonstrates the importance of something called the Big Creek Fault. The Big Creek Fault is basically the dashed line that runs from northwest to southeast all the way through the property. This is a controlling structure that goes all the way up into Alaska. It's a controlling structure for Goldcorp's Coffee deposit. It's a controlling structure at Fiordland's Tenacross property in Alaska, which just got optioned by Freeport-McMoRan. And we have the longest road accessible portion of the fault. Now, on our property, one of the types of deposits that we're looking for is porphyry deposits. That's the big one I'm going to be talking about today. Porphyry deposits are relatively unusual in Yukon. And that's because one of the prerequisites for porphyry deposits is to have an intrusion or a magma body come to high crustal level. And in Yukon, that's not something that typically happened. But here, we have the perfect coincidence of geological events that did allow that to happen. So, right in there, in that area, there's two strands of the fault. And in between those two strands, where the Big Creek Fault separated into these two strands, there's something that's called transtension. And it's basically this happening. You're opening a void because of the movement on that fault. And that void gets filled with an intrusion, and now we've satisfied a prerequisite for having a porphyry deposit in an area where there are very few. Now I'm going to focus in on that area and talk about what we did when we tried to identify exploration opportunity. The main thing that we did was we took the $50 million worth of data that had been produced through exploration generating the resources, and we looked for anything that was high grade but not explained geologically. We zeroed in on one area, very close to what's called revenue in the center of the map, but not at revenue. Now, revenue is one of the resources, and it's centered around something called a diatreme. A diatreme is basically the root of a highly explosive volcano. The mineralization was controlled by the emplacement of that thing, and that's what the resource there was. But there were 3 drill holes that had very high grades relative to the resource and very long intersections. And these things were collared, these drill holes were collared outside of the diatreme, and they were drilled away from the diatreme. So they didn't seem to be controlled by what we thought was a geological model there. So for instance, we're looking at, on the bottom intersection, 145 meters of about 0.22% copper, half a gram gold, 0.11% moly. That's more moly than most molybdenum mines have. So after we did that desktop study, we went and visited the property. We visited outcrops. We relogged core. We looked at this stuff. And this is what we saw. Beautiful stockwork, veining with sulfides, the kind of stuff that you expect to see in a porphyry, not related to a diatreme. So just a quick geological lesson. Most places that have mineralization are affected by fluids that have moved through the rocks. And those fluids, we call them hydrothermal fluids in most cases, they affect the rocks. They change the types of minerals we see in them. And you can tell what the temperature of those fluids were based on what minerals the rock becomes. Now, everything related to the diatreme, all that mineralization, had affected the rocks such that they had low temperature mineralization, low temperature alteration. But this stuff was super high temperature alteration. There's no way that you can make a rock look like this from an event that only causes low temperature alteration. So now we knew that whereas previously there was a diatreme that came up that caused mineralization, now we know that that diatreme came up into rocks that were already affected by a previous stage of porphyry-related mineralization, a brand new exploration opportunity that created the highest grade intersections from historical drilling, which had never been explored for before. So the new model is, well, now there's a giant intrusion that we can explore on a regional scale for porphyry mineralization. So what did we do? We went back to basics. We started looking at anomalies. We did a bunch of anomaly stacking. And when we took a look at the soil geochemistry, and this is really robust soil geochemistry in the Yukon because the area has never been glaciated, at least not for 1 million years. So good way to develop a good soil profile. We're looking at, this is golden soil, a heat map for golden soil. And what we're looking at here is one of Western North America's largest and most intense multi-element soil anomalies. This thing is gold, silver, copper, molybdenum, exactly the set of elements that you would want to see for a porphyry. And the centers of these bullseyes are super high grade, over 1% copper and over 1 gram gold in soil. So all of the areas on here that are circled are areas that we looked for porphyry mineralization in. And you know, we thought when we looked for that porphyry mineralization that we were going to find a little bit of it here, a little bit of it there, and that we might be able to vector in on an actual porphyry system. What shocked us and impressed Goldcorp was that we hit that stuff everywhere every single place that we tested, we found porphyry and or epithermal style mineralization. And so the previous idea was that this soil anomaly was sort of leakage from the revenue and nucleus deposits, and then dispersion near surface. But that's not the case. We've now proven that we are sitting on top of a vast hydrothermal system, an in situ hydrothermal system that is caused by a porphyry intrusion. Now, I could go into the details of each of these areas that we tested, but I'll just show you one, just to the east of revenue. And the little blue line that just appeared on the screen right there, I'll show you a cross-section through there of some of our drilling. So in 2018, we drilled in that area, and we defined a 450-meter long strike length of basically high-grade porphyry mineralization. Farthest to the southwest, 245-meter intersection that had a high-grade core, about 60 meters of 1.5 grams gold equivalent, and then farthest to the northeast, 119-meter intersection with a 57-meter high-grade core, was 1.72 grams gold equivalent. And that's with an actual gram of gold and about 0.3% copper. And when we hit that, we said, okay, this is it. This is what we need to find more of to have an economic porphyry on a road-accessible property in Yukon. So we followed up with that in 2018, and all of the northwest to southeast oriented drill traces here are holes that we planned for 2018 to test across that area and to expand it. That's when we discovered Yukon's highest grade porphyry. I'll zoom in on that area and show you where our high grade intersections are. All of those red intersections are higher grade porphyry material than has ever been intersected in Yukon. The sort of star of the show here is hole 19, the long one that goes from northeast to southwest, and it's 316 meters of 1.1 gram gold and 0.27% copper, plus molybdenum and silver. That was one of the best intersections that was made on a greenfields project last year anywhere in the world. And that's not the only kind of good intersection that we made. Just for comparison, if you look at the grade of that hole compared to other deposits, porphyry deposits that are economic and being mined in Canada, the gold far surpasses the gold in those deposits, and the copper is basically about the same for most of them. I'll show you a cross-section through the thing along this line, just to show that it's not a one-hole wonder. Here we've got 2 holes, great continuity of mineralization within the mineralized zone and between the holes, and these things are running like 1.5 grams gold and 0.3% copper. This is what the rock looks like, good porphyry style stuff. We've got lots of visible gold. You know, the guys in the field, every time they found visible gold, they had to send me an email with a picture of it that said VG alert. I was getting those 2-3 times a day. It was crazy. It was so much fun. Okay, now, I'm going to zoom out here and show you why this isn't anything compared to what we think we've got going on. First, I'm going to show you the area of the soil anomaly. See this mountain range? It's huge. That whole thing is the soil anomaly, okay? 5 spurs off of a ridge, 4 creeks, and those creeks, each one of them is either an active or a past producing placer mine, including the Dawson Range's richest placer mine. And then mineralization, mineralized zones across the entire area. We've now defined the whole thing as an in situ porphyry-related hydrothermal system. In cross-section, cartoon cross-section, this is what it looks like. Mostly, the orange stuff is a granite. And then there's a diatreme that busted up through the granite. In shaded here, there is the extent of drilling. Nowhere has this thing been drilled past 500 meters. Now, geology lesson number 2. For a porphyry deposit, you have to have an intrusion or a magma body that is the same age as the mineralization. And we've got 2 possibilities for that. The first possibility is that it's this orange thing. The second possibility is that it's whatever the source for the diatreme and a bunch of dikes that come up, in which case the intrusion is buried. Now, it's difficult to distinguish different intrusions when an intrusion comes up into another intrusion, that sort of thing. So the best way for us to define where this causative intrusion is using something called geochronology, where we find out the different ages of the different intrusions. Well, this stuff is all 105 million years old. And the diatreme and the quartz feldspar porphyry dikes are all 75 million years old. So there's two magmatic events separated by 30 million years. If the mineralization is the same age as the 105 million year old intrusion, then we're probably looking at the eroded root of what was once a porphyry deposit. If the mineralization is 75 million years old, then it probably comes, or it has to come, from a buried intrusion that's the source of the diatreme that has never been tested by drilling. We have all kinds of geochronology that shows that the latter is the case. It's all 75 million years old. So what's our model? Our model is that underlying this sucker, there's a great big causative intrusion. And if you look at porphyry deposits around the world, the best and most continuous mineralization is at that interface between the causative intrusion and the surrounding country rock. Now, I've made this thing really big, and I don't think I've exaggerated by doing that. The hydrothermal footprint that this thing has caused, the soil anomaly and all the mineralization we're hitting at surface, is more than double the size of the hydrothermal footprint at Cascabel, and it's only a little bit smaller than the one at Oyu Tolgoi. Now, I'm sure that you've seen lots of people say, oh, there's an elephant lying underneath this thing. I'm not the only guy who thinks this. The geological map made by the Yukon Geological Survey came out in 2018, put a cross-section right through that area, and on their cross-section, they've got a great big causative intrusion underneath this sucker as well. Okay, so we now know that it's geologically mandated that there's a causative intrusion underneath this thing. How do we know if that's going to be mineralized? Well, at the end of 2018, when we were developing this idea, we ran a great big IP survey, 7 kilometers across the entire soil anomaly and deep penetrating. What we'd expect to see is this thing to just light up at depth underneath where we've already drilled. And this is what we're looking at. A huge chargeability anomaly underlying the guts of this thing. And the only place that it's been tested by drilling is at Nucleus, farthest to the east, and that's where there's a multi-million ounce epithermal gold deposit. That thing is continuous across the whole zone into areas that have never been tested by drilling, including the area underneath our high-grade porphyry intersections. So this year, we're going to be drilling Yukon's deepest hole ever into Yukon's richest porphyry. And when we hit this sucker, we're going to blow the top off of the Yukon. And then this is the stuff John Anderson usually talks about. I can hook you up with him if you're interested. So I'd love to talk to anyone. We're just about finished doing a private placement at the moment, which would be the best bang for your buck if you're interested in making an investment, and that's happening right now and it's closing soon. And so I'm happy to talk to anyone about that as well. So thanks for the opportunity. So this thing could start as shallow as 550 meters, like the big part of it. But we are planning on drilling some 1,600 meter deep holes. Like, you know, Sol Gold at Cascabel, they didn't even hit anything good until 700 meters. And it just kept going to 1,600. So, you know, using that as a model. So the deepest hole previously is about 600 meters, but it's an inclined hole, so it didn't make it to 500 meters depth. My pleasure.
Think you understand the junior mining sector, and you think that the participants in the mining sector, junior mining sector, are good people and kind people, hit the bid.
How violent that term could be, it actually could be quite violent. It could be a rip your face off uranium rally.
And the world is always going to need raw materials. It's going to need copper and gold and nickel and so forth.
Totally destabilized. Hey, Troll, did you hear what's going on in Yemen?